Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we are taking a look at something pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
A fiscal collapse so profound, it actually required the intervention of an entire state legislature.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the city of Warwick, Rhode Island, which by 2025 found itself, stripped of its local budgetary authority
Right?
and placed under the control of a state-appointed budget commission. And the reason, well, it was a colossal, multi-million-dollar structural salary deficit that, just blew the system apart.
And that implosion, our source material confirms it wasn't some kind of freak accident or a sudden event.
Yeah.
We're working primarily from the Cushman report, which is, well, it's basically an exhaustive autopsy of fiscal failure that spans 2 whole decades.
An autopsy, that's a good word for it.
It really is. It shows how the city actively chose to ignore demographic data, starting from the early 2000s. The report's central thesis, and it's frankly, it's chilling, is that this was a crisis of choice, not a crisis of chance.
It's the cost of ignored warnings. The Cushman report is, it's meticulous in breaking this whole 18-year period down into 3 distinct phases.
Yeah.
And I think, just for context, we have to know where this all started to understand just how badly things went wrong.
Absolutely. The first phase, which the report labels Phase 1, that was a time of strategic alignment. And, the district handled it relatively well. They made necessary, if painful, cuts.
Right, they were doing the hard work.
They were. Then came Phase 2, reactive alignment, where, the discipline started to falter a bit, the decisions became more inconsistent. But today, we are zeroing in on the final act.
Phase 3.
Phase 3.
Okay, let's unpack this. How a system went from managed decline, even, reactive decline, to a full structural collapse in just 5 years. So our mission for you, the listener, is to focus exclusively on that final catastrophic period identified in the report. Phase 3 structural decoupling, which covers 2020 through 2025.
And we should be really clear here that when we say Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3, we mean it exactly as the report names them. And Phase 3 is just so critically important because it's the era where district leaders, they entirely abandoned any pretense of alignment.
Any at all?
Any at all. This is when spending and staffing levels became completely disconnected, decoupled from the stark reality of plunging student enrollment. And maybe most dangerously, this widening structural gap was masked, just temporarily, by this huge one-time injection of federal COVID relief funds.
Creating a fiscal time bomb.
Exactly. Time bomb with a very clear expiration date.
So we're looking at what amounts to institutional suicide by data denial. And it was fueled by a temporary financial sugar high. Let's start at that critical pivot point, the exact moment Warwick officially entered Phase 3. The sources indicate that despite really clear warnings from a comprehensive third-party analysis that was the Barton-Gilman audit delivered in late 2019, the school committee immediately rejected the structural changes it mandated.
The rejection was immediate, and it was highly consequential. Barton-Gilman had laid out all the facts: high teacher labor costs, excessive staffing levels, and a complete failure to adjust operations, even though they'd lost over 1,400 students since 2006.
The numbers were right there.
They were, and the recommendation was unambiguous. It said prompt structural changes, including staff reductions and consolidation, were absolutely necessary to avoid worsening deficits. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a mandate if they wanted to keep fiscal control.
But instead of following that expert advice and, beginning the painful process of right-sizing, the committee chose to institutionalize the problem.
And that's where the political choice comes in. You have to look at the vote on May 12, 2020. This was a moment Phase 3 truly began. Under the then-chair, Karen Bacchus, the school committee voted against issuing certified teacher layoff notices for the upcoming fiscal 2021 budget.
So the superintendent, Philip Thornton, he had proposed a responsible plan.
He had. A plan that included targeted staffing reductions, which was, fully consistent with the audit's findings and the reality of their shrinking student body.
So Thornton, who is the chief executive, he's responsible for the financial health of the whole operation. He proposes this realistic reduction plan, and the elected body just publicly overrules him. What was the political justification for that, especially right at the beginning of the pandemic?
Well, the political atmosphere, you can understand it, right? It favored stability. But the report argues this was a profoundly dangerous way to apply that idea of stability. That vote, made right at the onset of the pandemic, it effectively discontinued any serious effort toward alignment that they had established in the prior phases.
So fiscal discipline was out the window.
Completely. The report makes it clear. Fiscal discipline was fully subordinated to political and external pressures, basically to avoid conflict with labor, even though the structural deficit already existed. They chose to ignore the long-term data in favor of keeping staff levels that were, well, demonstrably unsustainable for the short term.
And the metrics, I mean, they immediately reflected this choice. It's like stepping on the gas when the warning light is already flashing bright red.
Exactly. The quantitative breakdown is it's stark. By the end of fiscal year 2020, because they refused those initial cuts, the Warwick School Department slipped into a high misalignment gap of negative 8.6%.
Okay, let's pause and define that for you, the listener, because it's a core concept here.
Right. So the misalignment gap is simply the percentage difference between the number of students you have enrolled and the number of staff you are paying for, based on modern standards. A negative gap means you are paying for staff you just don't need based on your enrollment.
So when they hit negative 8.6%, they were already paying for almost 9% more staff than their student population justified.
That's right. And critically, the sources confirmed that the district never recovered from this high misalignment gap. It only grew wider every single year after that. That initial move into the red zone signaled a systemic and now, an institutional unwillingness to right size, even when they were handed comprehensive third-party evidence demanding that they change.
And that unwillingness to right size became the default, didn't it? It just became the organizational habit. And it cemented the transition into phase 3.
It did.
That sets the stage for the next crucial battle, the debate over the fiscal 22 budget in April of 2021. And this was, in hindsight, the last realistic chance to realign the district before those temporary federal ESSER funds, which were already starting to flow, were due to expire.
And Superintendent Thornton, who was, at this point, he's still fighting a losing battle, he presented the committee with a dire data-backed warning. He laid out the arithmetic so clearly.
What did he tell them?
He said enrollment had declined 13% since 2016. That's 1,200 fewer students. Yet staffing levels were virtually unchanged. He calculated that proper structural alignment required 74 professional staff reductions. And he proposed a moderate, a politically palatable 35 reduction plan as a first necessary step.
So not even the full 74, just a first step.
Just a first step. And it wasn't just staffing. He warned them about the financial mechanism they were starting to rely on.
The ESSER funds.
Absolutely. He warned that the district was already overutilizing ESSER to maintain overstaffed positions, which he said guaranteed a future deficit unless structural cuts were made immediately. He was basically telling them that using temporary money for permanent salaries was a time bomb.
And how did the school committee respond to this? This definitive data and this very clear warning.
They adopted a path of complete and total inconsistency, which is, the hallmark of governance failure. The committee simultaneously rejected Thornton's staffing cuts,
Okay.
requesting the necessary additional local funding to cover the overstaffing.
Right.
Yet they adopted a budget that was fiscally incapable of balancing.
They wanted it all. They wanted the outcome of financial stability without making any of the necessary, albeit painful, operational choices.
Exactly. And this inconsistency is where the political dysfunction, it transitioned into deep governance fractures.
And those fractures, the report emphasizes this, they were intensely personal. It points specifically to the deep personal and political conflict between Karen Baucus and Judith Cobden. In an environment already reeling from a pandemic and structural debt, that internal conflict must have just been debilitating.
It was incredibly destabilizing. The Baucus versus Cobden feud was like a political proxy war that actively fractured the committee at the exact moment that unity and focus were most needed.
Right.
What started as a disagreement over budget priorities, Baucus pushing for alignment and Cobden pushing for labor peace, it just devolved into this consuming political conflict. And these disputes completely overshadowed the real fiscal issues. They eroded what little public confidence was left, and they prevented any cohesive action.
And that internal war led directly to a major leadership shift that just made the crisis worse.
It did. In January 2021, Judith Cobden overthrew Baucus as chair, and she was supported by 2 inexperienced, newly elected members. The sources note the timing is just critical here.
How so?
Baucus had been holding the line. She was demanding significant structural concessions from the teachers' union in the upcoming contract negotiation. Cobden's successful overthrow and her rush to negotiate the new teacher contract immediately after that, and specifically by excluding the superintendent, that became the final catastrophic precursor to full structural decoupling. They had effectively chosen a path of political accommodation over fiscal data.
So that transition cemented the shift. They went from a body that was merely reactive to one that was actively dysfunctional, and they were silencing the voices of expertise in favor of their own internal political maneuvering.
And that brings us to the moment where that political maneuvering became a full-blown operational dismantling. The report calls this the pivotal governance failure.
The unilateral exclusion of Superintendent Thornton from the contract negotiations.
Exactly. And this action, it didn't just break political decorum, it fundamentally broke decades of established financial practice in the district.
It sounds less like a snub and more like, I don't know, self-sabotage. I mean, the superintendents are the executives responsible for aligning personnel with enrollment and projecting long-term costs. Removing him was like removing the only voice in the room that was grounded in data.
That's precisely the point. Chair Judith Cobden unilaterally removed Superintendent Thornton from the May 2021 teacher contract negotiations. And by doing this, she was denying herself and the committee the one essential source of expertise.
The data.
The data on demographics, enrollment projections, long-term cost sustainability, all the things that were absolutely necessary to craft a sustainable labor agreement. The report argues this was just an unforced error of epic proportions.
Let's quantify what Thornton was actually fighting for before they kicked him out of the room. What did his data show was necessary for long-term stability?
Well, Thornton's plan wasn't based on politics. It was based purely on enrollment decline. The documented 1,200 students they'd lost since 2016. His data-driven plan required 2 tiers of cuts.
Okay.
First, an immediate 34 professional staff reductions for fiscal 22, just to reflect the current decimated enrollment numbers. And second, an additional 75 reductions over the medium term to fully align staffing with the ongoing student population decline.
So he was advocating for over 100 necessary staff reductions to fully eliminate the structural deficit. To put that in perspective for you, the listener, how significant is cutting over 100 positions from the school department?
It's a massive structural undertaking. It's the kind of thing that requires real political courage and institutional planning. And it's the kind of difficult process that the district had successfully managed back in phase 1, but had since, completely lost the will to execute. Thornton had the detailed, painful map to fiscal recovery.
And what was the outcome of the negotiations led by Cobden and the committee without that data-driven executive presence?
The contrast is horrifying. The contract signed by Cobden was costly, and it completely contradicted Thornton's detailed plan. It committed the district to millions in permanent, recurring salary and benefit increases. But here is the financial poison pill in the whole thing.
Okay.
The contract itself created a new, unfunded liability so significant that it required an additional 20 to 30 cuts in fiscal 23 and 4 or more cuts in fiscal 24 just to pay for the raises it guaranteed.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the magnitude of that mistake. So they rejected Thornton's plan to cut staff to stabilize the system.
Right.
Then they signed a contract that guaranteed massive permanent raises. And those raises were so expensive that the contract forced them to make even more cuts, potentially over 30 more cuts, just to pay for the new raises.
That is the precise interpretation. They signed a fiscally impossible document. They rejected necessary cuts, signed a contract that required even more cuts to fund itself, and then excluded the one person who had the data and the plan to make those cuts happen.
The consequence for Thornton must have been immediate. I mean, his authority was just gone.
It was an untenable position. The report really stresses this. He was financially responsible for an operating budget and contractual commitments that had been negotiated entirely in contradiction to his core data and comprehensive planning. His departure became, inevitable.
And with his exit, Warwick lost the only detailed, comprehensive plan capable of stabilizing the system.
The district was left completely exposed to the structural imbalance he had fought so hard to correct.
And what followed was the elevation of Lynn Dambruck, a long-tenured administrator in Warwick. And you would hope that someone with deep institutional knowledge would recognize the severity of the crisis.
And that's where the failure of institutional memory becomes just so obvious. Dambruck had lived through the entire history. Phase 1, Phase 2, the Barton-Gilman audit, and Thornton's final warnings about needing over 100 reductions. Yet despite having access to all the audit and demographic projections, NESDEC, SMMA, She implemented no plan to downsize,
No.
no staffing realignment strategy, and adopted what the report describes as a business-as-usual posture.
She essentially chose organizational drift and, quiet maintenance over the necessary structural pain and confrontation.
Precisely. Her tenure, which spans this critical period, it just solidified the systemic breakdown. Instead of making the hard choices that Thornton laid out, she leaned entirely on temporary federal funds, that ESSER money, to mask the growing structural deficit. This ensured that when that federal funding inevitably ran out, the resulting crisis would be catastrophic rather than just manageable.
She enabled the crisis.
She did. She enabled it to intensify by providing this false sense of fiscal security.
Here's where it gets really interesting and maybe the most frustrating part. The money that was intended to stabilize the district and help with COVID recovery ended up just hiding the bomb, allowing the structural debt to just mushroom unchecked. Let's talk about the inflow of those federal relief funds, the ESSER funds.
The scale of the funding was enormous for a district of Warwick size. They received over $19.1 million in one-time federal relief. That's ESSER 1, 2, and 3, distributed between fiscal 21 and fiscal 25.
And this money, it was meant for emergency, non-recurring expenses, right?
Exactly. Facility upgrades, HVAC, short-term academic intervention, not for supporting permanent staffing payrolls.
But the report details a profound strategic failure in how these funds were deployed. I mean, they treated a one-time bonus like it was a permanent raise.
That's the perfect analogy. Instead of using the money for restructuring or, one-time capital improvements, the vast majority of the funds were used to sustain an inflated staffing level. They purchased labor peace and they just deferred the crisis.
But the crucial mistake was that the cost structure they sustained became permanent.
It did. When those one-time funds expired, those temporary positions, which should have been cut years earlier due to enrollment, were absorbed into the district's permanent baseline budget.
And that's the mechanism of structural decoupling right there. The staffing level is maintained by temporary cash, and then when the temporary cash leaves, the inflated staffing level remains as a permanent local burden.
Exactly. And we have to reiterate Superintendent Thornton's final warning, which looks incredibly prophetic in hindsight. In his fiscal 22 budget presentation, he explicitly stated that the district was, quote, overutilizing ESSER 3 funds beyond the extent recommended in order to minimize the number of staff reductions. He understood that using temporary money for permanent salaries was not only financially irresponsible, but it guaranteed the upcoming deficit unless alignment cuts were made.
And we know Danbrook's administration continued this practice after he was pushed out. How much of that ESSER money was essentially burned just to keep this inflated workforce frozen in place?
The sources show a staggering figure. The largest use of these funds occurred in fiscal 22, totaling over $9.5 million. That's nearly half the total allocation, followed by $4.6 million in fiscal 23. This confirms the practice of prioritizing workforce stability over structural solvency continued long after Thornton was gone. They used the money to effectively freeze an already overstaffed workforce in place, even as enrollment continued to drop dramatically.
They were paying millions to perpetuate the problem.
They were.
So they purchased about 3 years of political calm, but at the cost of structural solvency. What were the unavoidable consequences once that ESSER financial crutch was suddenly kicked out from under them?
Well, once ESSER expired, and you have to remember these funds were finite and they were time limited, the underlying misalignment grew to a scale that was just unprecedented in the district's history. The structural gap grew to 6 times greater than the pre-COVID levels we saw in 2019.
6 times.
The financial deterioration by fiscal 24 and fiscal 25 was catastrophic because there was just no mechanism left to cover the excess salaries.
And that explosive growth in the underlying deficit leads directly to the political result, the state takeover.
Correct. The sheer financial pressure from the structural deficit created a total collapse in financial oversight. Salary overspending reached over $6 million in 2024 and $9 million in 2025, according to the report. This is why city officials, who had tried for years to pressure the school committee, finally lost all confidence in their fiscal governance.
So the ESSER funds were the catalyst.
The Cushman report explicitly states that the strategic misuse of ESSER funds was the catalyst that transformed the misalignment problem into a full, unavoidable structural collapse. Without that temporary influx, the crisis would have hit earlier, maybe in 2022, but likely at a smaller magnitude. By delaying the inevitable, they amplified the consequence.
It's a classic case of kicking the can down the road, except the can contained a live grenade.
That's a good way to put it.
All right, let's get deep into the raw numbers that define Phase 3. When you compare the enrollment loss to the staffing changes over this 5-year period, the term decoupling is not just accurate. It feels mild.
The comparison is truly jaw-dropping, and it's something you really have to absorb fully. Let's look at the data from 2019 to 2025. That's the Phase 3 window. Enrollment declined by 947 students, which is a drop of 10.8%.
Okay, almost 11%.
However, during that exact same period, staffing increased by 24 positions, or 2.2%.
So in 5 years, almost 1,000 students vanished from the desks, and the payroll gets slightly larger. The staffing levels are completely inverted from the needs of the organization.
It's not just misalignment, it's an active and counterproductive management philosophy. And if we zoom out to the full scope of the 2 decades, 2007 to 2025, the total student loss was 3,725.
Wow.
Versus only 353 staff positions reduced overall. This means for every 10 students they lost in 2 decades, they cut only 1 employee. But the damage done in Phase 3 is just so disproportionate because they chose to grow staff when they should have been making deep cuts.
So let's focus on that excess staffing explosion. How far out of sync did the district get?
The growth in excess staff was exponential. It was driven by the refusal to cut and that ISER subsidy. Excess staffing ballooned from a manageable 28 full-time employees in 2019, that's right before Phase 3 began, to an astronomical 191 full-time employees in 2025.
191 excess full-time employees. That is an increase of more than 6 times the pre-COVID level. It's hard to even visualize that number, but that means for every 5 employees they actually needed based on student ratios, they were paying for when they absolutely didn't. It's a phantom payroll that was, for a short time, federally funded.
And that ballooning is cumulative. The report details the cumulative number of excess positions for Phase 3 alone. That's the years 2020 through 2025 was 871.
871.
That's 871 person-years of salaries paid for positions not justified by the student enrollment. And consequently, the alignment gap, that key metric, remained firmly in the red zone every single year, ranging from the critical negative 8.6% in 2020 to a catastrophic negative 15.5% by 2025. This exceeded any sustainable threshold known in municipal finance.
And that structural imbalance comes with a direct, massive price tag. This is where the sheer cost of failure becomes undeniable, and it falls squarely on the taxpayer. What was the net financial impact of all that Phase 3 excess staffing?
The approximate excess cost for Phase 3 from 2020 to 2025 was $80.7 million, and that figure is calculated after reducing it by the $19.1 million in ESSER funds that were used to temporarily shield the district from the full weight of those salaries.
Okay, let's make that calculation crystal clear for you, the listener. The true gross cost of the political decision to maintain and grow staff during this 5-year window was over $99 million. But because the federal government covered $19.1 million of that temporary payroll, the deficit that the local taxpayer is left holding the bag for is $80.7 million. That is just staggering.
That is the precise reality. And to truly grasp the scale of the failure, we compare it to the entire 18-year period. The total cost of misalignment across all 3 phases, from 2007 to 2025, was $127.6 million. This demonstrates that Phase 3 alone accounted for nearly 2/3 of the cumulative financial damage that was accrued over 2 decades.
The final 5 years were the most reckless.
They were. They turned what was inefficiency into systemic failure.
You know, I think many listeners, when they hear about a school financial crisis, they immediately assume it was an issue of underfunding. They assume the city or the state just didn't give the school department enough money. But the Cushman report has an almost shocking section that completely disproves that revenue failure argument.
This analysis, which the report calls the avoidable spending analysis, is, I think, the most powerful nugget in this entire deep dive. It just strips away all arguments and all excuses about inadequate revenue. The sources modeled a simple hypothetical scenario.
Okay.
What would have happened if the school committee had simply maintained the 2020 misalignment gap of negative 8.6%?
They didn't even have to fix the problem. They just had to stop it from getting worse.
Exactly. They simply had to hold the line. Just stop the runaway hiring and staffing growth that occurred under Dambrook and the Cobden and Galligan committees.
And what were the results of that moderate hypothetical action? What would simply stopping the growth have saved?
If they had just held the line, the district would have avoided the addition of 247 unnecessary excess staff positions between 2021 and 2025. This single act of governance discipline would have saved the district $29.2 million.
$29.2 million in avoidable spending. Now, this is the key juxtaposition that proves the governance failure. So you have to compare that $29.2 million in spending they chose to incur with the new revenue they received during the same period.
Right, and the sources show that in Phase 3, the district received $24.4 million in local funding increases, meaning the city and state were increasing local aid, plus the $19.1 million in Easter federal funds.
So that's a total of over $43 million in additional new resources poured into the system during Phase 3. They received $43 million in extra cash, yet they racked up $29.2 million in spending they didn't have to incur. The analysis concludes that the revenue was more than adequate. The crisis was solely due to the choice to add and maintain those 247 excessive staff positions.
The report is unequivocal on this. The crisis was fundamentally a governance failure at its core, not a revenue failure. They were given more than enough money, but their political decisions actively chose structural insolvency by ignoring the necessary cuts and staff reductions.
And this catastrophic operational failure was, it seems, mirrored on the capital side, specifically with the coordinated consolidation failure and this massive problem of underutilized schools. The report details a real absurdity here.
This is a devastating layer of financial mismanagement. The core problem of underutilized elementary schools, operating at just 50 to 70% capacity by 2024-25, that was documented years ago. It dates back to the 2015 SMMA roadmap. Experts had explicitly recommended reducing the elementary footprint from 16 schools to maybe 10 or 12 to right-size the system for the demographic reality.
So the data was there. The roadmap was there. What did the leadership do about these warnings?
Nothing, or actually worse than nothing. The school building committee, the body that was charged with overseeing tens of millions in bond funds and met nearly 100 times between 2019 and 2025, never once discussed elementary school consolidation, building utilization, or right-sizing the system.
Never once.
Never. They simply abandoned the 2015 roadmap and focused solely on construction projects.
That is just institutional blindness. And the sources show they were actively spending bond money, taxpayer debt, on these demonstrably underutilized buildings.
The bond mismanagement is severe. Over $16 million of Phase 2 bond funding was spent on capital projects at low utilization schools. Scott, Lippett, Cedar Hill, Oakland Beach, and Park schools that were operating well under capacity. These investments were made without any documented consideration of whether those schools should remain open or whether students should be redistricted.
Wow.
They were, in the report's stinging conclusion, reconstructing the shell of a district that no longer exists.
That's a powerful image. They were spending massive amounts of money to maintain a sprawling physical structure that the demographics had rendered obsolete. And this, of course, brings us to the monumental decision to proceed with the $350 million high school debt bomb.
That decision cemented the long-term crisis. They are mortgaging the city's financial future to construct 2 new high schools, even though current middle and high school utilization hovers near 50%.
50%.
This ignores the demographic reality that a single unified high school might have been the only fiscally responsible choice. The leadership prioritized new construction contracts and, political appeasement over matching the district's capacity to its dwindling student population.
And that capital debt, that $350 million, that will require massive annual debt service payments for 2 decades. And it's hitting a city budget that's already consumed by legacy obligations. We're talking their massive underfunded pension and healthcare debt. The operational and capital failures are now guaranteed to collide.
And as the fiscal crisis accelerated toward the cliff edge, the structural paralysis of the school committee just deepened. So we arrive at the 2024 to 2027 collective bargaining agreement negotiation, which was the most consequential financial event of the period, and leadership was just fundamentally absent.
This is the empty chair scenario, a key failure of governance at the 11th hour. The sources revealed that during the negotiation for the largest line item in the budget, the teacher contract, the school committee was functionally neutered.
They were bound by state ethics rules. Chairman Sean Galligan and the previous chairman David Testa were legally prohibited from participating in negotiations.
Right.
They were blocked by the Rhode Island Ethics Commission's nepotism rules because they had immediate family members employed by the department. This silenced 40% of the elected committee, including the key leadership, from participating in the delicate give and take of bargaining.
So the people elected to guard the long-term fiscal health of the taxpayer were legally forced into the hallway during the moment of maximum consequence. The negotiation was then completely outsourced.
It was outsourced to unelected individuals, an outside attorney and later a mediator, Frank Flaherty. The report argues that in this vacuum, the goal fundamentally shifted from achieving structural alignment to simply achieving labor peace.
They just wanted to avoid a strike.
At any cost. Avoid a strike or a public confrontation.
And what was the quantifiable price of that peace?
The resulting 3-year contract, delivered by the mediator, added an estimated $8.2 million in new costs, without demanding any of the structural changes the district desperately needed. No modern benefit cost sharing was introduced, no staffing realignment was mandated, and nothing was done to address the core deficit problem that Thornton had identified years before.
So they signed a deal that solved a political problem, avoiding a strike, but simultaneously guaranteed a catastrophic financial one.
That's the conclusion. The committee approved an expenditure level that their budget absolutely could not support. The $9 million deficit that ultimately triggered the state takeover is, in part, the direct result of a contract signed in this vacuum, where the elected officials couldn't shape the financial parameters but felt compelled to approve the final, financially unsustainable package.
This highlights a deep contradiction in the mandate claimed by the leadership, specifically Chairman Galligan, who was quite vocal about defending local control.
The contradiction is striking, and it's tragic. Galligan was highly visible, submitting testimony, loudly fighting state intervention that would strip his fiscal authority, the formation of the Budget Commission. Yet he quietly accepted the state regulation, the Ethics Commission mandate that stripped his power to negotiate the very costs that created the multi-million-dollar deficit.
So he fought for the right to own the budget deficit.
Yes.
But surrendered the power to prevent it in the first place.
Precisely.
And this entire sequence, the structural decoupling, the explosion of excess staff, the ESR misuse, the lack of consolidation, and the leadership vacuum during contract talks, it all culminated in the final dramatic action that we started with.
The Rhode Island General Assembly created the Warwick Public Schools Budget Commission. They acknowledged that the systemic governance failure, documented over 2 decades but made catastrophic in Phase 3, demanded decisive external intervention. The school committee had demonstrated through its actions, or rather its inactions and politically expedient choices, that it was completely unwilling or unable to undertake the necessary structural reform.
So we have spent this deep dive detailing the collapse of Phase 3 structural decoupling. And what we've learned is that the data proves this crisis was not an unfortunate circumstance. It was structural and fundamentally self-inflicted. Warwick leadership, across 2 decades, but most intensely from 2020 to 2025, repeatedly ignored data and warnings from external experts, its own former superintendent, and even its own financial modeling.
Let's anchor the learning for you, the listener, by reviewing the 3 phases one final time, pronouncing them as Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3, which were the strategic phases of the report. Phase 1, strategic alignment, worked because governance discipline kept costs manageable.
Right.
Phase 2, reactive alignment, faltered because consolidation stalled and staffing cuts became inconsistent. And finally, Phase 3, structural decoupling, collapsed because staffing grew while enrollment plummeted, ACER temporarily hid the problem, and leadership abandoned all structural planning in favor of political peace.
So what does this all mean? It means governance discipline matters infinitely more than available revenue. The analysis shows that even with $43 million in extra funding pouring in between 2020 and 2025, the district generated $29.2 million in avoidable costs, simply by choosing to add and maintain those excessive staff positions. The choice to decouple staffing from demographic reality resulted in an $80.7 million crisis that now requires state management.
It is a stunning and cautionary case study in what happens when political expediency consistently overrides operational necessity.
And this leads to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, that takes us beyond the school department. The Cushman report focuses heavily on the school system's failure to downsize and its operational debt. But the city side, the municipal government, is facing its own structural crisis. Exploding unfunded pension and healthcare liabilities, totaling over $1 billion in municipal debt, and the imminent arrival of massive repayments for that $350 million high school bond.
So if the city's budget was already consumed by rising legacy costs while the school system was structurally overextended, what will happen when both debt bombs collide? And how much higher must the mismanagement tax on the Warwick taxpayer climb, considering the city is already projected to exceed its legal debt limit by over $200 million just on the municipal side? The school crisis is solved by the state intervention, but the larger combined municipal collapse may just be beginning.
That is the question hanging over Warwick's future. Thank you for joining us for this illuminating deep dive into structural fiscal failure.
Until next time.